Hello, and thanks for joining today's episode of the Macrocast. I'm your host, Ylan Mui, a managing director at Penta. Brendan Walsh of Markets Policy Partners is my co-host. John Fagan is out today. Well, Brendan, I feel like Labor Day is a distant memory at this point. Summer's officially over, even though it's still like 100 degrees outside. But we're all back in D.C. in person. Congress is coming back into session as well. So I'm super excited today that we have our very special guest, Ed Mills, a managing director and Washington policy analyst at Raymond James. He's here to talk to us about the shutdown, 2024, and of course the Fed. He's also a longtime friend of the pod. So, Ed, welcome.
Longtime listener, first-time caller.
All right.
Actually, it's true.
We're going to remedy that, though. We're remedying that. So, Ed, all right, just give it to us straight. Do you think there is going to be a shutdown after September 30th, and will markets even care if it happens?
I think the easier answer is, will the markets care? And it's a no. We were looking back since 1995, where all market shutdowns, market generally goes up during a shutdown.
Really?
Yeah. And because, debt and the deficit matter. But if you kind of look at the two, the debt ceiling debates, if we were to default on our government debt, that was a 10. Yeah. This is a 2.
Yeah.
And could we shut down? Sure. Are there real issues here? Absolutely. But I also see some path forward because House Republicans say they want a series of changes or kind of real cuts to the government spending, but they've only actually passed one of the appropriation bills. So they're not in a good negotiating position in terms of what does the final deal look like. So I think the most likely outcome is a short-term extension, a month, 6 weeks, do something related to the disaster spending because we've had wildfire.
Right.
We've had, kind of a couple of disasters. We've had a couple of hurricanes, fires in Hawaii. The big question is what happens with Ukraine funding. I don't think the House includes it. The Senate probably adds it back on. And that's where we might get the shutdown is if we have a true standoff. But I think that this is a really live to fight another day. And if we have a shutdown, it's probably closer to Thanksgiving than the end of this month.
Do you think this even drags out to the end of the year? Could it be a, holiday shutdown, perhaps?
Absolutely. But what Republicans want is they want to make sure that whatever extension here is short enough so that they don't get jammed up. When I worked on the Hill, I always said the most powerful group were the congressional spouses. That when it was right before.
No, it's true.
It's true. It's like I sat there as, getting a phone call from the husband or wife of the member I worked for. And it was like, when are they going to be done? We have plans. We're supposed to go on this vacation. Kind of Chuck Schumer has turned to his caucus before. He's like, do you want to spend Christmas with me? Or do you want to spend Christmas with your, kids and your grandkids opening up presents? Right. So the forcing mechanism of holidays is real. And so House Republicans say, let's do a 6-week extension so we're not up against the December holidays. Let's have that and do it 6 weeks because that's still a couple weeks before Thanksgiving. So if you need to push it down, or have a shutdown that is 5 to 10 days, you're still not up against Thanksgiving and ruining folks' holidays because if it gets to Thanksgiving, it gets solved.
So you think the markets are just kind of immune to this at this point because they've seen this play out so many times before. And ultimately, it does get resolved. And ultimately, the workers who are furloughed end up getting back paid.
Yeah, every single time they've gotten back pay. There's a couple of areas. If it goes on for a really long time, then we're dealing with some approval processes through different healthcare agencies. The SEC is not able to register new IPOs, so there's a slowdown there. Where we have seen some impact before is on consumer sentiment. And so we are in a macro environment that's a little bit tepid, and we're very concerned about the consumer. So if this is different, is this one of those things that pushes us a little bit closer to recession because the consumer sees DC dysfunctional again, pulls back because they're not quite sure? I think on the margin, it's important, but probably not something that is going to be a game changer in any way, shape, or form for this market.
Yeah, and we talked about that last week because the economy is actually quite good, but the consumer is still so pessimistic. So this is just another reason for the consumer to be pessimistic.
Yeah, because things are expensive.
Yeah, yeah. No, the consumer's still spending. They complain about it, but they still go out and spend.
Shocking.
I can't believe I'm pulling out my credit card again, but I'm just gonna swipe or I'm just gonna tap.
No, the shutdowns in DC are kind of fun because everyone knows you're gonna get paid eventually. So like kind of Wednesday, everyone's out partying at noon.
Yeah, you get shutdown specials at the bar.
Yeah.
You know, kind of it's a like some of the best happy hour deals in the city.
Yeah.
You know.
Putting your political hat on, I know we spend so much time here talking about sort of the macroeconomics and the data, but one thing that we've been kind of kicking around too is this idea that, you know, a shutdown could be a political necessity in the sense that it provides sort of a venting mechanism for House conservatives. They can say that they did something, right? And they can sort of get it out of their system so that we can move forward. Do you think that that actually could help the process?
It's potential. I think that there are some House Freedom Caucus members who look at this and say we cannot have debt limit 2.0, and that if McCarthy cuts a deal that requires Democrats to come on board, that there could be a motion to vacate the chair. And actually, back in January, when there was round after round and round of votes, that was getting a lot of the fight out, and it kind of has actually helped McCarthy throughout this year. I think that the balance here is you absolutely have that fight and the desire for that fight, but does that win you a single seat in the House of Representatives? It's a really narrow majority. McCarthy's job has been to show the country that if you elect Republicans to lead the House of Representatives, the government can function. Because on the margin, the seats you have to win are seats that are currently held by Democrats to expand your margin. So if you shut down the government, and I think that's part of the reason why he did not want to default and wanted to have a lot less drama this year, is because his goal is trying to win the majority again in 2024. And it's really, really close. Democrats only have to pick up 6 seats, and we've had some redistricting cases that probably maybe get them even halfway there already.
How do you think the economy is playing into the 2024 election so far? I mean, it seems like, you know, Brendan, you just mentioned this disconnect between sort of sentiment and, you know, the macroeconomic data. We see it in Biden's poll numbers as well, where the economy's
came out
doing well.
yesterday or the day before. Biden's numbers are pretty terrible.
But they are. Despite
but I think
Biden
that's a little more unique to him being old, you know, than necessarily totally the state of the economy.
So we looked back at Raymond James and we saw that in the last 80 years, or during Biden's entire lifetime, every president has been reelected unless there was a recession.
Yeah.
And so that is George H.W. Bush.
Yep.
That's Trump, Carter, Gerald Ford. If there is a recession next year, that is one of the biggest risks to his reelection. If the economy holds in and we get the soft landing and we avoid recession, the bet is he wins reelection. So it is the economy.
But it also seems a little bit lopsided, right? In that if the economy is booming, he may not get a big bounce in poll numbers. But to your point, if the economy bottoms out, if we're in recession, then it seems like it's over for him, right?
Yeah, you only get the downside.
You only get the downside. That's right.
Yeah. But the Republicans are safe because who they're going to run is, doesn't have any controversies around him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a year out, one thing that we always look at for kind of, polling data is, approval rating. Because if you are underwater on your approval rating, it's hard to win re-election. Yeah. But if Donald Trump is the nominee for the Republican Party, his disapproval or upside down approval versus disapproval is about the same as Joe Biden. So it's just a question as to
Oh, that's interesting. So they're about equal?
They're about equal. Sometimes Biden is a little bit more net positive or a little bit, they
that's
trade off.
But
it is, and we have never had in the modern era, a former president running for re-election. So it's normally the incumbent gets the, all of that baggage and the challenger gets any of the upside. But there is, kind of both are very well known and very well kind of established in terms of if you like them or dislike them.
Yeah.
Well, and then I think does it also speak to this idea that, the disapproval, how do I say this? The dramatic disapproval for Trump is driven by the level of animosity among Democrats, and the dramatic disapproval for Biden is driven by the dramatic animosity amongst Republicans. So it's really, they almost like cancel each other out. It's just the strength of the base.
Yeah, and it comes down to the middle, and the middle will vote on the economy.
And do you think the economy is going to be the issue? I mean, we talked about the recession and how that could factor in, but it seems like right now there's also so many other issues that could be top of mind for voters, whether it's social issues, healthcare issues, whether it's legal issues, right? I mean, where do you think the economy is going to rank?
Abortion.
Yeah, it's going to be one of them, but all of those issues are going to have huge importance. One of the things I view about politics is that things are impossible right until they're inevitable, and it changes on a dime. And so one of the things that I always warn people when we're talking about an election that is more than a year away, like it could, it could very easily be a replay of 2020. It can be completely different as well. So, abortion issues, social issues, economic issues, legal issues, all of that will factor into it. We just don't know exactly what the weighting will be until we get much closer to this election.
Yeah, I feel like I did so many stories around the midterms, headed into November about poll after poll showing inflation, the economy was top of mind for voters. Then we have, not a blue wave, but certainly at least a blue ripple, right? And then the storyline was all about, well, this was about democracy. This was about governance. And we thought we understood the polls. We thought we understood the voters. And, they had something else in mind.
They frequently do.
Yeah, they do.
I think, the one thing is that I've viewed a lot of times in elections is that the group who actually is the majority is the leave me alone crowd. So if you get the candidate that you think is going to be the least impactful on your daily life, oftentimes they win. And so in some ways, when Donald Trump would call Joe Biden Sleepy Joe, there was a certain voter that's like, yes, please give me something sleepy out of D.C. The question here is that for that voter, did the agenda of the Biden administration so far, which has been actually far more kind of aggressive in their ability to accomplish things than I think people would have given them an opportunity for.
It really is one of the most unprecedented first 2 years of an administration in terms of actually passing.
Yeah,
usually
with
get
the 50-50
one, maybe
Senate.
two, but they've had like 4 really big bills.
Yeah, and so it's like, does that voter say, as long as Congress does not continue to do that, I'm fine with keeping the incumbent, or do I want to stop that? And then it comes to the alternative, and the alternative, if it is former President Donald Trump, his 4 years in office were not kind of a leave me alone type of period. It was DC was front and center.
Yeah.
So I that's where I think it's very difficult to know exactly what voters are going to want to have.
The one that cracks me up is the Inflation Reduction Act, which really is just the infrastructure bill.
It marked the top.
Yeah. No, but it's actually very popular in red states because they're the only ones that have approved any of the project. All the blue states, it's still caught up in state level bureaucracy. So that on the ground is actually a very popular project because actually things are getting built.
Yeah, and I think that what's amazing about that is that we look at the estimates in the Inflation Reduction Act, say it's about $400 billion of tax credits on green energy. There's no limit to exactly how much gets spent. The
CBOs already have to revise it up. It's getting taken up much quicker than they ever expected.
Exactly. Yeah. And the Biden administration, when they have an opportunity, they expand the definition through the regulation.
Yeah.
We had permitting reform or phase 1 of permitting reform in the debt limit debate. And if we get more permitting reform at the end of this year, that $400 billion, we could look back in a couple of years and see it easily go to $1 trillion. Does it go more than that? And then that really helps as the conversation we started with, which was the fiscal spend of this country. Is the House Freedom Caucus going to get a budget cut? Those budget cuts compared to the spending of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the CHIPS and Science Act are dwarfed. And so when we talk to our economist, he is increasingly adding in upside to the economy in terms of kind of fiscal support for the economy because of those bills. And they're going to have runways of 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, they don't need new legislation to be passed. People just like them, and the way that they were structured, it can expand.
Yeah, I looked last week on the infrastructure bill, and that's I think everyone in the market has kind of moved on. That's done. We've only announced about half of the funding, about $260 billion of the funding. A lot of that hasn't even gotten to the states. It hasn't gotten spent, so we still have another kind of half of it to announce. and probably 70 to 80% of it to actually be spent, which again is
amazing.
more fiscal support for this economy. And so if you have a slowdown, that's going to put a lot of construction workers, a lot of people within infrastructure, keep them employed through an otherwise normally weak period.
And that was part of the point, right? That this was a long-term investment, and they tried to emphasize that even at a period in which the economy was, maybe not in the greatest spot, but that this was a once-in-a-generation investment. This could change the trajectory of the economy. This wasn't, handing out checks directly to households.
Yeah. And even beyond that, we actually really need it. Like our infrastructure is falling apart.
Yeah, and we've been talking at Raymond James about how we are in the early innings of an industrial renaissance in the United States because of this. And what is different about this is that historically, when we talk about the industrial base of the United States, it's usually through the lens of jobs, which are incredibly important. But the new lens that DC has seemed to be putting on this is through national security. That COVID and kind of the U.S. China trade war, supply chain has taught us that if it is important to us, we need to make sure we have control over that supply chain, that it is built here, that our technology is a national security asset. And we want to, if it's not built here, then we want to make sure it is built by a friend. Right. And so
John and I in a separate endeavor are very involved in that. And it's really been very enlightening how much the government, especially the Defense Department, understands that and is putting money behind that.
Yeah. I talked to someone who is a former official at the Defense Department, and what he said to me is like, look, it's no secret that we have spent, kind of countless years protecting the oil reserves of the Middle East, because that's how we fuel our economy. As we move to a more electric economy and our vehicle fleet gets electrified, we cannot change that geopolitical risk from the Middle East over to China. And when you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, some of the largest subsidies are for EV battery recycling and manufacturing here in North America, not just in the United States, North America. And then you source that material. Anyone who is a friendly nation of ours, it's a game changer.
Well, this was also the impetus for the CHIPS and Science Act, right? I mean, that was exactly how it was couched, and that's why it was able to get that bipartisan support, both from folks like Chuck Schumer and from folks like Todd Young.
Yeah, it's not a hard. We know that China eventually wants to invade Taiwan, and that's where all the chips are. So we got to get them out.
And I think we have kind of really awoken to this idea that how did we ever let kind of such an important piece to the economy, the semiconductors, you don't.
And it's even more. It's gone parabolic in terms of the value of a chip to the world economy.
Why did we ever let it go in such a geographically and politically vulnerable area? And so it's going to take time. And on the CHIPS and Science Act, we've almost zero of that money has gone out.
I know, yeah.
And so it's like that,
Still writing the regs.
No, like the one we were supposed to build one in Arizona, but that's kind of got.
Yeah, and so I think I guess the criticism is, and what happens all the times when I'm talking to investors is people see the bill, they get excited, the bill passes, these companies are coming out and kind of coming up with all these projections of all this support that they're going to have and all this ability to expand production and upside. Stocks react to that. And then 6 months later, the money hasn't gone out. And then everyone is like, what happened? Stocks come back in. Everyone declares it dead. And then a year later, they actually get the money and it starts to work. So we're kind of like past that peak excitement point, and we're probably over the next couple of months going to see a lot of those stories of what a company has told us is not coming to fruition, because with DC, companies are always able to almost project out to like, blue sky. And when it doesn't happen, they have a bureaucrat to blame.
Yeah. And it's not just money. It's also expertise. Like the reason Taiwan became it was they as a government saw that they needed to do something that was really important. And they decided, okay, semiconductor chips, this nascent industry. So they spent a lot of money to train Taiwanese people to know how to do it. And that's how that happened. We don't have the expertise. So we not only have to put money behind building the factories, but we also have to start educating people to know what to do.
The good thing, though, is that we have the patents and we have the technology, and they. And
we have immigration, right?
We have immigration. We have so many kind of things that are working.
Lately, but we still do.
Yeah, there's so many good things about what we have in terms of natural resources that it's when we make this commitment to support some of these industries, we have over time the ability to actually do it.
Yeah.
Well, Secretary Raimondo was one of the biggest proponents of the CHIPS Act, and she recently went to China. Was that a productive trip? What do you make of her visit over there?
I think it was a productive trip. Our call all year is that the Biden administration wanted to engage at high-level conversations because they know that the relationship can't materially get better. They just don't want it to materially get worse. And they describe this as conversation without compromise. And so the big part of that trip was establishing a new dialogue 2 times a year with the Secretary of Commerce's counterpart in China. And so if there are flare-ups, and we are seeing a flare-up this week as it relates to Apple, are there an opportunity to talk about this? We are going to get in the next couple of weeks some more tech restrictions on the semi-cap equipment and semiconductors that can be exported from the United States, as well as the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea. That is a hurdle that we have to come over. I don't think it is going to really deteriorate the relationship more, but China will respond. They know that it's coming. They don't like that it's coming. But quite frankly, there's not much that they can do because their economy is quite weak right now, and they are struggling how to respond in a way that harms us more than it harms them. And with the nature of all their joint ventures, most of the time, any of their response would have at least an equal negative to their own economy.
How do you see China's struggling economy? I mean, I feel like the Western world looked at our experience coming out of COVID and we're like, oh my gosh, everything went gangbusters. China comes out of COVID and they stumble out the gate. How do you think that resets their role in the global economic order? Does it?
I think that you're seeing a lot of estimates that kind of China's economy overtaking the United States economy, that's not the trajectory anymore. We do see a Chinese leadership that is much more insular than they.
This is a choice. It's not they're not screwing it up. They're actively deciding not to expand and to become Xi's. It's all driven by Xi.
And Xi is not going to the G20. And
which is unprecedented.
Especially when you have one of the kind of other kind of competitors in the region, India. I mean, it's like if you're China, you do not cede the stage to Modi in India. But, there's another person that's not going to the G20 because he'd be arrested is Vladimir Putin.
Maybe we do want him to show up after all then.
And so if she went, most of the votes as it relates to the communiques coming out about Ukraine right now are going to be 18-0. Yeah. I don't think she wanted it to be 18-1 and have to vote time and time again as the only defender of Putin. But it does show some of the things that we don't know about China. This is an honest surprise that he's not going to the G20, and it leads to a lot of questions as to why. Is the domestic hold on power not as strong as we think it is? Is the economy worse than it is? How does China respond to that? They could do some things to add to stimulus. The thing that could be an impact to the market is if they start blaming the United States. That a lot of Chinese leaders have held on to power through propaganda. Usually it's directed towards Japan and how terrible Japan is towards them. But because we've had these tech restrictions, the thing to watch as an investor is how much do they start blaming the United States and how much is that taking out on U.S. companies? Certainly something that we're starting to see a little bit. We don't expect it to ramp up too much, but that is a tail risk out there.
Yeah, and I mean, just going back to the Chinese economy, like we're gonna keep going back and forth. But you as a Chinese foreign direct investment was always a huge part of the growth story in China, and now you as a multinational company just can't risk opening up a new factory or anything in China. You could just get taken over. You have to start expanding out of.
Yeah, no, there is a big push, and this is part of why it is going to take years to do the IRA, the Chips and Science Act. It's part of sending the message to the multinational business community that if you have something that is sensitive, you might want to reconsider kind of where that is headquartered.
I mean, Apple's the perfect example, but they're stuck for a while. They can't not produce phones there, but they are certainly if they hadn't already started, it started yesterday, that they're going to come up with a plan to start building, factories somewhere other than China.
Yeah, and I think that so for a long time, and for the last 5 years, as I've been on this U.S. China beat, kind of Apple always came up, and I was like, no, Foxconn is too much of an employer throughout China for kind of the Chinese government to go after it. There was something that did happen this week that hadn't previously been in there, which is the founder of Foxconn resigned and has decided to run for the presidency of Taiwan.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and so the KMT, which is the preferred party of Beijing, had a candidate, the mayor of Taipei, technocrat, looked like he had a shot. With the Foxconn founder entering this, it looks like the incumbent party, the DPP, which is the pro-independent party, the anti-Beijing party, now, as of today, looks much more likely to win re-election. And so, I put in this U.S.-China relationship, the semiconductor restrictions, the new Huawei phone that seems to be competing with 5G. There's a lot of factors, but I haven't heard a lot of conversation as to whether or not this Foxconn portion of Apple has been changed because of the desire to run for the presidency, which is in January.
Do you know why did he decide to do that? Was it like a slap in the face to Xi?
I think there's been a couple of other independent candidates in there, and the kind of incumbent party, the DPP, their candidate has been viewed as relatively weak compared to the incumbent president. It's the incumbent vice president who is running. So, when there is an opportunity, it was more of an opportunity knocks versus I don't think it was to kind of undercut the KMT, but it was more of a as in the United States, when someone sees a potential opening to be the leader, you kind of take it.
Yeah, there was a report out of Japan, the Nikkei newspaper, that apparently Xi was called in front of the elders this week to say, like, this is not acceptable, what's going on in the economy.
Yeah, no, it's the and if you remember in the lead up to the party congress that gave him an unprecedented third term, there was a lot of those stories. There was a lot of question, and he did what he needed to do to consolidate power. But I think a lot of people look at China, look at Xi's leadership as a monolith, and when I talk to our contacts, they're like, it is until it's not. And that like he is always going to need to kind of preserve. And when you have the economic weakness, people get very concerned about the civil unrest that comes with that.
I mean, this is official statistics, so it's probably even worse. But the youth or the young person unemployment rate is above 20%. You don't want a lot of unemployed males that don't have wives, because of the restrictions. That's a powder keg for
and then you look at the demographics of China. Over the next,
people don't realize how bad the Chinese demographics are.
Yeah, it's going to be a population that starts shrinking sooner rather than later. And they'll be upside down in terms of a far greater older population than younger population.
Yeah, in terms of the developed nations, the U.S. actually has probably the best demographics. People don't quite realize that. Yeah,
and the thing that I always talk about with demographics and the hidden, we talk about housing, and it's the demographics. Housing is not a discretionary choice. It's like you need to occupy a unit of housing at a cost, and so. We're kind of dealing with some pretty high mortgage rates. The last time we had really, really high mortgage rates was like 1980.
Yeah.
What did home price appreciation do then? It went up.
Yeah.
Because, I always go back to the average first-time home buyer is 34 years of age. What happened 34 years before, 1980 minus 34, 1946. The baby boomers.
And so now there's a weird dynamic. If the Fed has other issues, but if they were focused on simply they wanted house prices to go down, ironically, the cutting rates would actually probably stimulate it, because something like 80% of people are locked into a pretty good low rate mortgage. So you have to have a big life event to move out of that mortgage, So it's just you don't have any supply in the market right now.
Cutting rates could actually increase inventory.
Yeah, because people would move.
We asked at Raymond James we do a monthly macro call with a bunch of institutional investors, management teams, and on average, people said the rates had to drop at least below 5%, maybe below 4% before they would be considered.
And that's a good cross section of America.
Yeah. And it's it's just and this, to me, one of the big problems for the Fed is that, as you taught me, Brendan, like with the components of CPI, 40% of CPI is essentially housing costs.
Just housing,
and
it's really just rent, because we don't measure what your house is worth. We measure what you could rent your house for. So it's all just rental.
Yeah, and very scientific.
If they don't like what you say when they survey you, they just put in their own answer.
Okay, because that's interesting, because I did that, like a kind of sample size of 2. I asked my wife what we thought we could rent the house from, and it was a very different answer for me.
Yeah,
so I was kind of, we were talking about how CPI,
so if someone's totally off,
noisy.
they just throw it out.
All right.
So Ed, is it your view that the Fed has made pretty clear that rate cuts are not now on the table, but eventually, at some point in time, they will start cutting rates? And is it your view that when the Fed does begin that process, home prices are going to plummet?
Well, I think if the Fed cuts rates, mortgage rates go down, and that, on the margin could unlock. But I do think the first move are folks who were on the sidelines who couldn't afford
exactly.
So
you
actually
get bidding wars.
You get more bidding wars, people thinking that this is their time, and that could bring about the second wave of inflation. And if 40% of CPI is kind of essentially housing costs, if we start seeing bidding wars in housing because of the rate cuts, then that's a huge problem for the Fed. And so what I've been telling investors all along is that they, the market was pricing in for a large part of this year the first cuts in November. And I'm like, that is absolutely the worst possible time to cut, because the other thing we've learned about inflation is it's a 12-month rolling average, and it takes some time for it to show up. And so if you're the Fed, you're like, well, it takes some time to show up. So if I cut, say, in May, it's not really showing up before the election. But if I cut the previous November, I'm going to have a full year in there. Like, just from a calendar perspective and how this math works, like, I couldn't get to how the market could have assumed a November rate cut. And I truly believe the higher for longer, partly because when I look at some of the people who might be on the Fed pushing for some of the cuts, like Dr. Lisa Cook, who got confirmed again this week to a 14-year term. We've had 2 other confirmations as well. Her first speech out of the gate was, the Fed's models are broken. I'm paraphrasing, but we need to get to the terminal rate, and then we need to hold it to make sure that the economic data that's coming in matches our updated models. So if she is internally saying, hey, I'm concerned about mortgage rates, I'm concerned about the unemployment rate ticking up, the Fed staff can go, well, you're the one that laid out the reason for why we need to hold for longer, which just kind of shows you, in my opinion, how the Fed does everything possible, especially among the governors, to make sure that there's consensus. They don't like dissent. They don't like that debate. They like to have that man behind the curtain moment of, we have our models. This is what they say. This is what we should do. Yeah.
No, that's John and I've been saying, but it's for the exact reason. We think that the Fed's done hiking, but that they're going to hold much longer than the market is expecting. And also, I think politics is not the driving factor, but they're aware of it. They're here in D.C. And most importantly, around election, the Fed does not want to be anything that either candidate is talking about, so you're not going to do anything, kind of out of the ordinary to make waves, so I think on hold is the probably the easiest way to solve that. Yeah,
and I wouldn't be surprised if we got one more rate hike.
It could,
we could.
Not in September, but
I think that
but I think we're close to
so I think that the 2 things that the Fed is afraid of is, one, a second wave before the election, because they're going to be,
that's a disaster.
Yeah, they're like, the Fed got it wrong again. Yeah. Look at regulation. They got inflation wrong on the upside. They also don't want to declare victory and say, like, hey, we're done hiking rates, and then have to do it again. So that's exactly this messaging we're getting right now, is like, why we paused and then hiked again. So it's kind of like, get us used to the idea that it's not kind of with the best precision possible, that, like, as data comes in, if we need to adjust, because they don't want to get second guessed.
No,
they don't
totally.
want to.
And oil is another issue, because that's entirely Saudi Arabia and Russia holding barrels off the market. So that's a supply issue that the Fed really has no control over. But the consumer is not happy about it. So, inflation is, at least headline, is going to go back up in August and September, just simply because gas prices are up. So it's another thing you don't want to be seeing weak as inflation, even though gas prices really, unless you want to drive the economy
I think that
into
the Saudis,
a huge recession.
The Saudis would have no problem with pain at the pump for the Biden administration.
No, without a doubt. Yeah.
The interesting thing that I think the debate is, does Putin actually want a relatively low oil price globally because he has to sell below the price cap? And the closer the price cap is to the actual price, domestically, it's kind of less explaining than it has to do. If oil spikes up north of $100 and he's stuck at selling things below $60, that is a political problem for him. So
that's a really important point.
So some of the energy experts that we've talked to say, don't be surprised if Russia actually tries to keep as much oil on the market as possible, because politically it's less explaining you have to do as to why you're kind of so outside of the differential between global prices and what you're getting.
But this is also why, too, the Fed looks at core PCE inflation as their main indicator. And there are, of course, now folks arguing for super core metrics, right, and taking out some of that housing component. But, I think it's very fitting that on the Macrocast, the conversation is wide-ranging, but somehow all roads do come back to the Fed.
Yep.
So thank you for joining us today. That does it for us. I'm Ylan Mui with Penta. My co-host is Brendan from Markets Policy Partners. Ed Mills of Raymond James, thank you as well for joining the pod. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Macrocast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening.